So, good morning, everybody, and welcome. This is the last class in the series of Called to Persevere. We've been looking at post-exilic prophets, Haggai, Malachi, Zechariah, uh, covering about a 100-year period from 538 BC when they returned to about 440, about 100 years. And when the people came back, they struggled. They had lots of issues. They probably thought that things were going to be miraculous because God had promised they would come back. But when they got back, it was hard work. And then they began to wonder if God was really with them. So God sent three prophets to reassure them, to encourage them, and to help them get through that period. And so I hope it was obvious why I titled the class Called to Persevere. And I also hope it was obvious to you how applicable a lot of these lessons have been to us. Uh, we are called to persevere. So today we're doing an epilogue. We're doing a follow up class because several of you had asked me questions that had to do with the period between the Old Testament and the New Testament. So I put together another page of selected dates. And again, and I hope you have the handout. Does everybody have the handout? Has everybody got the handout? Yay. Okay. The handout, this is Karen Strong's selected dates, just the ones that I thought were interesting. And you see up at the top there, we start in the Persian period where we've been with Malachi's messages from God to the people. And that closes out the Old Testament in our book, in our uh, collection of biblical books. And the next thing that happens that is that was important enough to make it to my selected dates is Alexander the Great. Now, remember, up until this time, the Greek cities had been city states, they hadn't been unified. But Alexander the Great's father, Philip, began to unify the Greek cities. And when he died, Alexander the Great inherited not only a more unified Greece, but also a really excellent army that his dad had put together. And so Alexander the Great, as soon as he solidified his reign, his uh, right to be king and leader, he started conquering Persia and spreading all over the world. And, you know, the Alexander the Great story is one of the great stories of history. But as he began conquering the world, he also wanted to make sure that the Greek language and culture spread throughout the area. So he conquered all of Persia and he began replacing the Aramaic language that was the language of uh, commerce and diplomacy with the Greek language and actively requiring that the Greek language be used. It wasn't just a suggestion, it was everybody's going to speak Greek and everybody's going to adopt the Greek culture. So he spread the language and the culture all over his vast empire. And he also built a city named Alexandria. Uh, you know, not that he was proud of himself or anything, but uh, what do they call that? An eponymous name, named it after himself. Built this great city of Alexandria, which was a great center of learning and commerce. And he invited Jews to come there and live. Now, let's stop just a minute and remember that the Jews had been centralized around Jerusalem in that area. And when they were conquered, not only were most of them carried off to Babylon, but many of the Jews, seeing what was about to happen, fled in other directions. A lot of them went to Egypt. A lot of them just went up into Asia Minor, just to get away from the Babylonians. And so this was the beginning of what's called the diaspora, or the scattering. Um, the dispersion of the Jewish people. And so Alexander encourages that to continue by inviting them to come live in Alexandria. And you may wonder why, but the Greeks recognized that the Jewish people were a good, stable community with good commercial capabilities. And so when they would establish a new city, very often they would invite Jews to come there and live. And sometimes they would offer like a bonus incentive if you'll come and live. Not only did he do that in Alexandria, but he also did it in Cilicia, in the city of Tarsus, which was another city of learning. And that's probably how Paul's parents got there and became citizens, so that Paul then was a citizen later on down the timeline. But the Greeks would invite Jews to come and settle in these new cities that they built. But as you know, Alexander doesn't live very long. He dies at 33. So in 323, he dies, and his empire gets divided up among four generals. And these four generals, because there was no succession plan because he was so young, nobody thought about a succession plan. So the four generals were Cassander, Antigonus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. Now, the only ones that we're going to be interested in are Ptolemy and Seleucus, because Ptolemy took over the part of the empire that was Egypt, and Seleucus took over the part of the empire that was Asia Minor and most of Persia. And that put Jerusalem right on the crossroads between those two empires. So once again, the Jews are caught in the crossfire, because the Jews live under the Egyptian Ptolemies for many years, until the Seleucids decide they want more land than they've got. Now, one thing that happens during this period of time when they're living under the Egyptians is, see, in 250, the Greek translation of the Pentateuch, the first 5 books, was completed. That's an important milestone. But then the Seleucids decide that they want to conquer what the Ptolemies have. So there's a war, and the Jews are caught in the middle. And eventually the Seleucids take over. And one of their leaders is a man named Antiochus IV Epiphanes. And this guy is notorious. He's sort of like Nero. You remember all the things you've heard about Nero being maybe mentally unstable and just ridiculous in his decrees. Well, Antiochus IV Epiphanes is the same way. Epiphanes is a word that means chosen by the God. That's a name he gave himself. And people joked about him and called him Epimanes, which means crazy person, so, or madman. So they did think highly of him. And one of the things he did was he decided that the Jews needed to be more Greek. They needed to be more Hellenized. And so he marches into Jerusalem and enters the temple and desecrates the temple, sacrifices a pig on the altar. It's just anything he could do to outrage the Jews, because he was showing off how powerful he was. And he then proceeded to make practicing Judaism illegal. He made it illegal for the people to practice circumcision. He made it illegal to observe the Sabbath. He just was doing his best to stamp out Judaism. Well, that didn't go on for very long. That was in 167 BC when all of that happened. It didn't go on very long before the Jewish people just couldn't take it anymore. And an old priest named Mattathias, who had five sons, refused to make the sacrifices to Zeus. And when he refused, it sparked a war. Now, the interesting thing about this war is it was sparked by what the Seleucids, the Greeks, were doing, but it was actually a civil war because part of the Jews were going along with being Hellenized, and part of the Jews saw it as an affront to their relationship with God. And so, actually, when this war started, it was a civil war more than it was anything else, because many of the Jews thought it was okay to speak the Greek language, to adopt Greek practices, and maybe we really don't need to do circumcision anymore. And so the population was divided. And Mattathias's son, Judas Maccabeus, you've probably heard about him. Maccabeus is a nickname he earned because he was so successful militarily. Now, the Seleucid army is huge. The Jewish people are a small group of people. And Judas is famous for developing tactics that, have come to be called today guerrilla tactics, where you just harass a larger army. And Judas was very successful at that. And so he led revolts against the Seleucids. And in 164, he actually took back the temple and cleansed the temple. And when he cleansed the temple and began to offer sacrifices, they found oil in the temple and they lighted the lamp in the temple. But there was only enough oil for it to burn for one day. It was supposed to burn continuously and never go out. It was only enough oil for one day. But miraculously, it burned for 8 days. And that miracle is what the Jews celebrate at Hanukkah. And that's why they have a menorah with 8 candles on it, because that stands for the 8 days that the candlestick burned in the temple. So then, after Judas is killed, Jonathan takes over and leads the armies. And they're not only trying to keep out the Seleucids, they are punishing the Hellenized Jews. They even went so far as to kidnap the sons of the Hellenized Jews and forcibly circumcise them. This was a very very difficult period in history. But eventually, the Jews get semi independence from Syria or the Seleucids, and that's in 142 BC. And this is the beginning of what's called the Hasmonean dynasty. So sometimes you hear it called the Maccabean period, sometimes it's called the Hasmonean dynasty. I had to look it up because the word Hasmonean seemed to come out of the blue as far as I was concerned. But that means it's the family of Simon, is what that means. So Hasmonean means of Simon. So the Jews are sort of in control of their country again. And there are 9 rulers in the Hasmonean dynasty. I didn't list all of them for you because toward the end, some of them only ruled for a couple of months when things started falling apart. But the Jews ruled their own country for a period of time, about 100 years. And during that time, the rest of the Greek translation of the Old Testament was done. So the Septuagint is completed in 130. That's what you call all the books of the Old Testament translated into Greek. So, as with many dynasties, things started out very upright and idealistic and disintegrated as the Hasmonean rulers went on. They became corrupt, things got bad, and eventually, then the Romans come in. General Pompey invades and defeats the Jewish people and institutes Roman rule. So that happens in 63 BC. Now, Pompey, when he came in, he famously entered the Holy of Holies when he got to the temple, which got the Jews and the Romans off on a bad foot to start with. Some historians say that Pompey didn't realize the significance of it and he, wouldn't have done it had he realized. Others say, he's just a general taking over, and doing what generals do when they take over. But for whatever reason, the Jews and the Romans got off to a bad start. Now, a little bit later, the Parthians conquered Jerusalem. If you've studied Roman history, you know that Rome battled with the Parthians for hundreds of years over where the eastern border of Rome was. The Roman Empire extended further east or less further east, depending on their battles with the Parthians. Um, the Parthians are the successors to the Persians, um, nomadic tribes that band together and take over that part of the world. They are famous horsemen, of course. Um, Many of the people there on the steps are very accomplished horsemen, but the Parthians mastered the ability to ride on a horse and turn back and shoot over their shoulder at people. They were extremely successful at it. And that was called a Parthian shot, which is where we get the idea of a parting shot today. So we can thank the Parthians for that. In 37, Rome reasserts their dominance and appoints Herod as king, client king, over the Jews. Now, this is an administrative tactic that Rome uses, and the Persians did too, and the Greeks. But if there is a strong local king who vows allegiance to the empire, well, then you let them set up business as a client king, and okay, you can keep your own people in line, and you can make sure that the tax money comes to me. And a client king can stay in place until it doesn't work anymore. And then Rome will just make you a province and you have a governor. Then you don't have your own king. So Herod the Great is the king, and he does a pretty good job of keeping the Romans happy. So on the sheet there, you'll notice that I noted that Augustus becomes emperor in 27 and reigns for 14 years. All this time, King Herod is in charge of things and in Judea. And King Herod wants to please the Romans, and he also wants to be great. So he has a huge building program, and he builds beautiful palaces and all kinds of amphitheaters and all kinds of Roman buildings. And he also decides that he wants to expand the temple. And so he builds a better temple, a bigger, shinier temple. It's got beautiful white stones on the outside of it. It's clad in these beautiful white stones. It's a magnificent building. And as a part of this, and I mentioned this when we talked about temples before, the temple was built up on a hill, sort of a mesa, and he wanted the temple area to be larger. So he built these huge retaining walls and filled in dirt to make the hilltop larger. And it basically doubled the size of the courtyards around the temple. The temple's still the same size it was, but the courtyards are twice as big with all these porticos and steps around it and just a huge area. And when you go to Jerusalem and you visit the Wailing Wall, what you're visiting is a part of that retaining wall that Herod built around the Temple Mount. And so this was a beautiful, startlingly impressive temple now, different from what it had been. One thing that always confused me is this is called the Second Temple period. Well, this is the third temple by my count. And so this always confused me. But as I've been preparing these lessons, I've learned that from the Jewish point of view, there was the first temple that was Solomon's temple, and then there was the second temple after they came back. And the second temple period includes from the rudimentary temple that was built in 516, that was completed in 516, all the way through the intertestamental period, including Herod's temple, and all the way through to, in the future, 70 AD, when the Romans will destroy the temple finally, once and for all. So, Second Temple Judaism is the whole period from the return to the destruction of the temple in 70 AD, in AD 70. Okay. Maybe no one else was confused by that, but I have always been confused when I would read about Second Temple Judaism because it didn't compute, but now I understand. So Herod's temple started in 19 BC, and it was mostly finished in just a few years. He did this huge building program, and it was mostly complete. But then he continued to work on it, and they say that he didn't finish the temple until AD 64. He was tweaking it. He was doing a little more here, a little more there. The thing about the temple that Herod built, when he expanded the courtyards, he also built a Roman fortress adjacent to the temple wall, the fortress of Antonia. And the Roman soldiers, when they were in the fortress of Antonia, could look over into the temple courtyards and monitor what was going on. So he not only built the temple and all of the courtyards and porticos and everything around it, but he built the fortress. And that's how the Romans were able to rescue Paul. Remember at the end of Acts when he goes to Jerusalem and there's a riot and the Jews are going to kill him, and the Roman soldiers come in and rescue him? That's why they were able to do that, because of that fortress built there on the side of the temple. Then Tiberius becomes emperor after Augustus, and then if you follow the timeline, then you get to the birth of Christ and the New Testament period. Now, one of the things that is really interesting to me as I do this study is they talk about this 400 years of silence between the Old Testament and the New Testament. Well, the um, the idea of silence is misleading because, and this is, I think this is true all the way through the biblical narrative. Sometimes God is perceived to be silent, but God never stops working through all of these periods. God never stops um, uh, being active. And that's true in this intertestamental period too. Now, I already told you about the diaspora. Let's look at how God was preparing the way for Jesus to come, preparing the way for Christ, preparing the way for the good news to be spread. So, we talked about the diaspora. The Jews were spread all over the world. And we know in the New Testament period, when we start reading in the Gospels, that there are Jews all over the Roman world. And in Acts, in Pentecost, it lists all the places the Jews are from. The Jews have spread all over the world. Now that's important. So hold on to that thought. Another thing that has happened is during the exile, when the people were away from the temple and there was no temple, and when the people were in Egypt, wherever they went, whether they were in Babylon or Egypt or wherever, they strengthened the synagogues as a place of study so that they could learn God's word and remember God's word, even though they couldn't do temple worship. The Jews say that there are two great pillars to their faith. One was temple worship, and the other was the Torah and knowing the rules and living properly, following the rules for life. And so when they didn't have the temple, they doubled down on the study of the Torah and the rules for living. So what happens is by the time that we get to the New Testament, there are Jews all over the world and there are synagogues all over the world. So there are places of teaching that are teaching the prophecies about the Messiah. Because the Greek language was forcibly spread all over the world, and the Romans adopted that, they liked Greek culture and Greek language, there's a common language all over the world. And we've talked about how the Septuagint was done. The Greek Old Testament was available. So we have a circumstance where there are Jews all over the world, there are synagogues teaching about the coming Messiah. Everyone's speaking Greek, at least as a second language, and there are scriptures in the Greek language. So this is preparation so that when Christ comes, the good news can spread. Now, also, there are the Roman roads. Rome built roads all over everywhere. Travel was easier than it had ever been before. And there was the Pax Romana. Now, you needed to be on the right side of the Roman peace to benefit from it, but it did make for a more secure and stable world so that Paul, for instance, could then travel and teach the good news. Now, another piece of this is as we're getting ready for New Testament times, a couple of things happened during the Maccabean period that are important. First, the Sanhedrin was developed. The Sanhedrin, the ruling council of 70 or 72, scholars are not sure which, but the ruling council was established. So that just happened 150 years before Christ came. Also, the sects, the Sadducees, the Pharisees, the Zealots, and the Essenes all developed during the Maccabean period. Remember, I told you that it was a civil war, and it was a fight over how Hellenized the Jews would become. Well, these different parties developed as a result of that fight. The Sadducees were in favor of being more Hellenized. The Pharisees believed that the law needed to be kept precisely. And furthermore, they thought the Messiah would not come until the laws were kept perfectly. The Essenes didn't want any part of this civil war and withdrew and lived in communes away from everybody. The Zealots were the murderous sect of the Jews that wanted to kill anybody who was getting in the way of their worship of their God. So these parties developed during the Maccabean period, and that's why they're present when we get to the New Testament. So the intertestamental period is a really interesting period because far from God being inactive, he may not be speaking through prophets during this time, but I don't know about you, but I see his hand at work preparing for the coming Messiah and preparing for the spread of the good news after he comes. So that is my wrap up of our study. I just couldn't end at the end of Malachi without exploring this little in between period. So, with that, we'll close our study of Called to Persevere.